Welcome everybody. Good afternoon. In fact, we've got a few people joining from overseas, so good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the latest BASIS webinar. As you probably know, we run these webinars once a month. We have done since the pandemic, which was when we started them, and they've proved to be useful and popular, so we've continued them, and we plan to continue them for as long as you find them useful. My name's Dom Goggins. I'm with BASIS, and my colleague Dom Jordan is also on the call today. Really grateful to you for joining us. And just our focus today is just over a week away from the start of the 2024 Olympics in Paris. We're going to take a look at the intensifying impacts of climate change on what is the world's greatest sporting spectacle. We're going to be focusing in particular on the Rings of Fire 2 report, which BASIS was really pleased to help publish last month. It was the second in a series of reports that BASIS has been involved with, which is looking particularly at extreme heat in the context of the Olympic Games. And the Rings of Fire 2 report received widespread media coverage around the world. Jamie Farndale, who's on our panel today, was at the forefront of a lot of that coverage. And I think, you know, I'm really hopeful that our panel today has got some really valuable insights that they're going to be able to share with you. The report is underpinned by climate science. It takes a really detailed look at the risks around competing in extreme conditions, and it draws from the leading science on thermal physiology, which Professor Mike Tipton, who's with us, is going to be able to share. But it's a first, this report, in the sense that it really centralizes the concerns, the perspectives, the experiences of athletes. Sorry, just be grateful if everybody joining could make sure that you are muted, just for the benefit of everybody else on the call. Yeah, it really centralizes the concerns and experiences of athletes. There were 15 world-class athletes, including 11 Olympians, who contributed to the report. And if you've not read it, I really would recommend that you do read it. I think it's quite a powerful piece of work, and there's a lot that it really does compel us to think through in some detail and very seriously. Our panel today, I think, couldn't be better suited to talk us through these issues. Caitlin Trudeau is the Senior Research Associate for Climate Science at Climate Central, and Caitlin was a leading contributor to the report. We're going to start with Caitlin in a couple of minutes. Jamie Farndale, who I've already mentioned, is one of Britain's best ever Rugby Sevens players, and he's spoken really powerfully about these issues. I'm sure you'll have heard him in the media talking about them before, but we're really lucky to benefit from Jamie's presence today. And Professor Mike Tipton, MBE, who is the world's leading expert on extreme environments. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Mike. Mike's joined us for BASIS webinars in the past, and he has a remarkable ability to explain really complicated things in a really simple and understandable way. And we're lucky to have all three panelists with us today. We have an hour to talk all of this through. The three panelists and I will have a little chat at the outset and try and break these issues down before an open Q&A, which you are all welcome to participate in. I encourage you to ask any questions that you have, make any comments that you have in the chat. When it comes to the Q&A, just use the raise hand function, and I will come to each of you in turn. And if you don't want to speak, then feel free just to post your question in the chat box, and I'll put it to each of the panelists. As I said earlier, please do stay muted if you can, unless you're called to speak, just out of courtesy to everybody else who's on the call. And please, if you can, if you're in a position to and you're willing to, do turn on your camera, because it really does make for a better conversation and a better environment for these discussions. I will talk you through a little bit about what BASIS has got coming up towards the end of the call, but without any further ado, I think we're ready to go. So, Caitlin, if I could start with you, just to talk us through a little bit of the climate science that underpins this report and what you found when you were working on it.
Yeah, of course. So hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Trudeau. Thanks for joining us today. So one of the things we really wanted to do with this report is take a look at how temperatures have changed since the last time Paris hosted the Olympics, basically 100 years ago. So we took a look at 100 years of temperature data throughout the French capital, and we found there's been a significant amount of warming over the last 100 years. And this has happened all throughout the summer, but specifically when we focus in on the time that the Olympics will be held, there's been a warming of 3.1 degrees Celsius of average temperatures, which is pretty significant. And during the times of the Paralympics, a little less so, but 1 degree Celsius warming over the last 100 years. And this is concerning not just because, increased heat causes all kinds of health problems and issues, but it's also exacerbated by things like the urban heat island, which plays an important role in Paris. So things are exacerbated there. And we know that this is a time where Europe and France in particular has seen particularly deadly heat waves, the deadly heat wave of 2003. And also in recent years, we've seen thousands of deaths because of extreme heat. So that is really exacerbated by climate change. We're seeing it more and more often. And every heat wave in the world is now made stronger and more likely to happen because of human-caused climate change. And this is something that's not happening just in Paris. This is happening across France as a whole. And it's something that will continue as long as we continue to burn fossil fuels.
Thank you, Caitlin. And this is a particular, because I remember with the Rings of Fire report ahead of the Tokyo Olympics, we were projecting that it would be the hottest Olympics ever. And I think that was found to be the case. And it's a particular concern, the trends that you're talking about, because Europe is the fastest warming continent on the planet. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, it's the fastest warming. Well, the Arctic is the fastest warming region, but Europe is the fastest warming continent, and so that's definitely concerning. So we're seeing a lot of the warming happening. It's really central in Europe.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. I'm sure we'll come back to bits of that in a second, but Jamie, I'm just going to turn to you now, if that's okay. We'll get into what it's like to compete in extreme temperatures at the start, but I mean, you had a long and very successful career, captain of Scotland, represented Great Britain on a number of occasions, and I think beat the All Blacks and England a few times. And I just give us a couple of highlights, because you've just recently finished playing. Just give us a couple of highlights from that career, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this is the first time introducing myself as an ex-rugby player. I retired about 2 weeks ago. The plan was to retire at the Olympic Games, but sport rarely works out the way you plan it. So we missed out on qualification, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, captaining my country was obviously a huge privilege. I got to play 60 different tournaments on the world stage. We won Twickenham back to back, 2016, 2017. And yeah, it's there's loads of highlights. The whole thing's just been amazing.
I'm sure it has been, and we're all gutted for you and for every British person, I think, on this call will be gutted that we couldn't quite make it to that last games. But I mean, congratulations on a stellar career, and I think everybody's going to wish you all the best for the future. And given the things that you've talked about in public, I think we're going to be working alongside you for a long time, and we're going to be lucky to be doing that. But your sport is unbelievably demanding sport. Rugby sevens is, for anybody who's seen it and anybody who's not seen it, I mean, you will have competed in all kinds of conditions, but the amount of ground you have to cover and the intensity you have to play with, when it comes to competing in extremely hot conditions, like, what does that feel like? Can you just talk us through a little bit of what it's like in the moment?
Yeah, you're right. So sevens is tough at the best of times. It's a big pitch you're covering with only 7 players instead of 15. So there's a high level of demand. And yeah, there's a couple of tournaments that stick out. Australia, Singapore. I think Australia gets up to sort of 40, 42 degrees, sort of dry heat. Singapore, I think, is around 30, 35, but there's more humidity. And they're the ones that stick out in my head where I really struggled with the temperature. And that's physical and mental. So physically, you just feel like there's nothing left to give. You try and sort of drop a gear, and there's just nothing there. You're almost just thinking about getting through the next phase. It just becomes a real struggle, and then mentally, your concentration goes. Rugby is a sport where you're constantly having to keep your head up and look at where the opportunities are, what the defense are doing. And honestly, I've been in these games where you're just dragging yourself through to the next phase, which you know, when this is what you've spent your whole life building up to, and you're suddenly on the world stage, and that's your mindset, I think not only does it make for a worse game to watch, it's also dangerous. And you know, I've struggled with that recovery. We play 6 games over 2 days, and your heat level, your core temperature just really doesn't drop. You know, we will jump in ice baths in between, but you feel sick in between, you can't cool down. It really does affect you. And I've had teammates that have had to spend a couple of days back at the hotel with heat illnesses. So it is dangerous as well. And I just finished Maddie Orr's book, and it talks about these instances where athletes have died. So that fatal threat that we're talking about, it is a reality. And yeah, I mean, I was reading this morning about the temperatures across Europe. I think Italy's up at about 42. Croatia and Spain have declared heat waves. So it is, yeah, unfortunately, it is, as we said, Europe is heating up, and hopefully we don't see these heats in Paris. But if we do, I think it's not too far to be saying there's a fatal threat there.
Is that something that you were aware of as a player, or is it? I mean, you know, you think about those moments in a game. I mean, obviously, from a spectator's point of view, I've never played sport at your level. Very few people have, but you know, you think about the crunch moment in a game, last minute, or you know, the kind of the key point, you know, potentially a turning point in conditions like that. You know, where a gap opens up and you see it and you can go for it, or you know, your opponent's got the ball and sees a gap, and you know that you're the only person who can catch him, and you're feeling all those things that you've just described. But in that moment, you have to peak. Like in an athlete's mindset, there's nothing that's going to hold you back in that moment, is there?
That's exactly the problem. So, you know, I've sort of talked about that DNA of an athlete is to push your body to the absolute limit. That's why at the Olympic Games, that's why these athletes are there, because that's what they do on a regular basis. They push past these limits. And in safe temperatures, that's one thing. But as we get into these unsafe temperatures, the athletes aren't going to hold back. So yeah, I think that's where it becomes really scary. And it was something I think I was aware of from my own experiences and from seeing, you know, playing in these hot conditions. But the work with the University of Portsmouth and getting in and getting some numbers to that in this report, I suppose just, yeah, putting some numbers to what we sort of knew, I think was really useful in being able to talk about it.
And is that like that's why you've decided to speak out on this stuff now, really? Is it kind of reflecting on that and your experiences in your career, but also, you know, just what you've learned about climate change as a student, and that's kind of why you've decided to step up and really make your voice heard?
Yeah, so I think, and actually a point I really want to get across is that this is a real challenge for sport, but you know, the answer here isn't adaptation, and it isn't how we can change sport, because we can change dates, we can change the time of day that you set off, we can use ice towels and you know, ice baths and things. But yeah, I think what I'm more broadly aware of with my sort of work in this sort of climate and sport space is that we are in this polycrisis where there are much bigger issues at 2 or 3 degrees worth of warming, and we can't just normalize that and work out how sport adapts. There's issues with growing food around the world. There's issues with, you know, above 2 degrees, it potentially, Aviva were talking about it becoming impossible to insure certain regions of the world. So that there are these huge existential threats that exist much more widely than sport. But I think what we could use sport to do is to talk about it in an understandable way. It seems like people aren't listening to climate scientists. So maybe if we start using sport and saying, look, this is the impact this is going to have on sport. You know, maybe it's I use the phrase canary in a coal mine. This is something that's really visible. The Paris Olympics, the impact that heat is having. But for me, this is much wider than just what the impacts are on sport. There's such a huge issue that we're dealing with in the climate crisis, and if sport can be used at all to get that onto the front page, then I think that's the importance here.
Yeah. Well, we'd echo that, and certainly with Basis, one of the things we're trying to do is kind of harness the power of sport to bring these issues alive for new audiences. Caitlin, I saw you nodding then when Jamie was saying people don't necessarily listen to climate scientists as much as they should do. I imagine that that's one of the reasons why you decided to get involved with this sort of work, to make sure that you could communicate this essential science to people who might not be listening
Yeah.
otherwise. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and it takes a group of trusted messengers to really kind of communicate that and deliver that message. And you know, Jamie and other people in sport are kind of a perfect example of people who can really bring this message to people who normally wouldn't be paying attention or normally wouldn't be looking into the science. And we don't know exactly what's going to happen at the Paris Olympics, but we do know that we're about to see some heat that was made at least 3 times more likely due to human-caused climate change Friday and Saturday. So in the Paris capital. So I just want to mention that we have a climate shift index, which looks at daily temperature attribution. And so looking at Friday and Saturday, Paris is going to see temperatures that are made 3 times more likely due to human-caused climate change.
Okay. So got all eyes on Paris from this point forward. And obviously the Tour de France going on at the moment in that country, there'd be, some risks around that as well. Mike, we've heard from Jamie about his experiences in those conditions. I think in a second we're going to come to you, if it's okay, to talk us through the science about what's happening in the human body under that pressure. I think before we do, I'm just going to try and play the video. Jamie, you mentioned about working with the University of Portsmouth. You took a trip down to the Extreme Environments Laboratory that Mike runs actually down at Portsmouth. We've got a video of that trip. I should say to everybody who's joined the call, we did test this in our little pre-call and it didn't work properly. So if it doesn't work, I apologize. We'll get it through to you, but I'm going to try and play it because I think it is certainly worth watching. Just bear with me. Can you all see that?
I'm not getting any volume.
I'm glad that worked. Jamie, obviously that was recorded at a time when you were anticipating being in Paris, and I'll feel the kind of heartbreak of that not happening. But just before we come to you, Mike, I mean, does it make you kind of worry for your fellow competitors ahead of the 2024 games, that experience?
Yeah, sorry. That was the volume didn't quite come through, so it was a bit surreal watching, but I think everyone got the sort of the gist of it. But absolutely. So pretty much we were put into this sort of steady temperature, and I was put onto a bike and did a certain level of work, and it was really easy, and I could have done it, forever really. And then as soon as we ramped the temperature up to 35, which I think we could easily be expecting in Paris, it immediately became really difficult, and all these physical factors and sort of my own experience of the effort level just went through the roof, and I was pretty glad to be done by the end of that second session. So just measuring how different that same work is at different temperatures was pretty eye-opening, and I definitely feel for the guys that will be on the pitch if we're up at that level.
Yeah. And Mike, I mean, I've been lucky enough to visit the lab down in Portsmouth. I mean, it's an amazing facility, but can you talk us through what's going on in the body, you know, in that under that kind of pressure in those conditions? I know you've got some slides, so you know, just feel free to.
What I'll do, Dom, is I'll share a few slides because a picture's worth 1,000 words. Although we've just seen quite a lot of pictures, so that was nice. And what I would say before I start is I completely support what Jamie said about mitigation as opposed to adaptation. Yeah, absolutely. We're all thinking about adaptation, but we've got to make sure that it's not a fig leaf for mitigation. And one of the reasons I work with BASIS is because it's a way of getting a large number of people, i.e. sports fans, that, you know, are literally millions and millions of people around the world, to maybe appreciate that the sport they love is going to be destroyed in one way or another unless they, you know, start lobbying for climate change. And so that, for me, is a really important. And as you say, Dom, that's exactly, you know, one of the primary drivers for BASIS. But so I'll talk a bit about what happens to the body, and we'll talk a bit about mitigation in terms of adaptations, you know, the wet towels, which Jamie's mentioned. But really, remember, at the back of it all, we've just got to try and address the core issue. So let me share some slides, if that's okay. It'd be about 5 or 10 minutes, just quickly a cook's tour through thermal physiology. Can I just check that everybody can see that? Yeah, just give us a thumbs up. Thank you, Jamie. Okay. So you've heard about the Extreme Environments Laboratory, University of Portsmouth, where we can recreate lots of conditions on the planet. And we all know athletes who have struggled in the heat, and quite a lot of them have visited the Extreme Environments Laboratory for one reason or another. We go from -25 to +50. We can control solar load, heat, etc., just as you'd expect. So we've looked at a whole range of sports over the years. In fact, I think the thermal aspects of sport, primarily as a consequence of the worries of climate change, have actually taken a much higher profile. It used to always just be training and nutrition, but now it's thermal. And that's important because whilst poor training and poor nutrition might affect your performance, poor heat preparation can actually affect your health. Just a little bit about Tokyo, which was the hottest Olympics up to that date. There are a large number of athletes studied. There were a total of 567 athletes, 100 heat-related illnesses, 541 non-athlete injuries, 125 of those were heat-related. And that's quite an important distinction to make, because we tend to focus quite rightly on the elite athletes. But remember, there are other people who are exposed to the heat. There are officials who are having to still run around soccer pitches and things like that, but probably are not at the same level of age and health and fitness as those that are playing the sport. And then you've got spectators who may well be stationary, but may well have several comorbidities that make them also at risk. So this is not just a problem for the elite athletes. There's paper just been published in the last couple of weeks looking at the sports for the Paris Olympics, of which 67% were estimated at low or moderate risk of heat stress. And among the 15 sports identified at a high or very high extreme risk, there's various contingencies or adaptations in place. One of them didn't have a heat policy. 3 didn't have any parameter associated with that measurement. 1 relied on water temperature, 2 on air temperature and humidity, 7 on the wet bulb globe temperature, which I won't go into great detail, but it's a way of combining radiant heat with humidity, with ambient temperature, to give you a much better overall idea of the stress associated with the environment. The problem with that is that it was actually developed for the military, doing military type activities. And it really needs to be reviewed in terms of its usefulness for the kind of sports which we're talking about here. And it probably needs to even be customized to each sport. And one is just a heat stress index, which combines temperature and humidity. Let's have a quick look at performance. We know that as that WBGT, or temperature, the thermal stress of the environment, goes up, between, on the right, you can see a WBGT of 10, 15, 20, 25, then percentage performances reduce, looking at about a 12% reduction in performance. at a WBGT of 25. Now that 25 can be produced by a combination, obviously, of temperature, humidity, and solar load. The largest component in it is actually humidity, because once air temperature gets above skin temperature, the only way you're going to lose heat is by the evaporation of sweat. The production of sweat is no good unless it evaporates, so it has to evaporate. So that becomes really important, and that's why high humid environments, environments with a high water vapor pressure, are actually significantly stressful in addition to the ambient temperature. So a hot, dry desert is in some ways better than a warm, humid jungle. So you can summarize all the work that's been done in this kind of area by saying that marathon performance decreases by about 1 minute for each 1 degree C increase in air temperature above 15 degrees Celsius. The ideal air temperature, incidentally, for continuous aerobic activities like marathon running is around about 11 degrees Celsius. We're a tropical animal. We want to be naked in 28-degree air, but we want to be at rest in that temperature. As soon as you start producing heat, the air temperature that's ideal for exercise and activity plummets down to about 11 degrees Celsius, because about 80% of the energy we consume exercising is released as heat. We're pretty inefficient. We're about the same level of efficiency as a car engine. And in terms of performance, heat, I'm not going to go into great detail because time won't allow, but there's 3 primary mechanisms by which you get impaired performance with heat stress. One is effect of cardiovascular function, because as you sweat, you dehydrate, and that puts a stress on the cardiovascular system, which has to work harder. You then get eventually compromised muscle blood flow, which means you switch to anaerobic metabolism sooner, which means you get exhausted sooner. And finally, the body will desperately try to maintain central nervous system, central cardiovascular performance by taking blood from the skin. And that's where you typically see somebody blanch white. They look very white, as did Johnny Brownlee towards the end of his triathlon in Mexico. If you look at the color of him, he's white because he's no longer sending blood to the skin, because that's being taken to try and maintain central function. There are direct effects on muscle function. As the muscles get hot, you increase muscle glycogen utilization, so you become exhausted more quickly. And we've touched on this a bit, but once in normal individuals, once you get a deep body temperature of around about 40, you lose the will to exercise. Central fatigue, it's called. Interestingly, elite athletes can override that. And they're the ones that will then push on and have the problem. And it's particularly the case if you put somebody in a competitive environment. And we've done the studies at Portsmouth, and we've shown that people who would normally stop and reduce their power output or their heat production will push on if they think they're in a competitive environment. And we see it not only, of course, with elite athletes, we've also seen it in recent times with special forces on selections in Brecon Beacons, for example. So there are several ways, and they all interact. We are an integrative animal, and so the sweating causes dehydration. That dehydration then affects skin, muscle, liver, central nervous system function. We can overheat and have direct effects of heat on the body, but these indirect effects are also caused by changes in the amount of body fluid we have to serve both our muscles and our temperature regulation. And so dehydration then becomes critical, and one of the protections against the heat is obviously to have a hydration strategy, because we know that you've only got to lose about 1 to 4% of body mass by fluid, and that's going to result in a 5 to 50% reduction in endurance performance. And it'll result in higher deep body temperatures. It negates any acclimatization that you've managed to do in advance, and it increases the chance of heat illness. We've talked about continuous activities and the kind of activity which Jamie gets involved in, the sevens. Absolutely, you're working hard, you're producing lots of heat, but you also get impairments from heat, from a hot environment in more passive sports. So that's because of the distraction, the irritability, agitation, reduced motivation, decreased mood, cognitive impairments, complex decision-making, such as pacing strategies and when to do what, are all impaired by increased temperature. I mean, you can imagine when you're doing something like a shooting event where the margin for error is tenths of millimeters, having sweat appearing and feeling uncomfortable and feeling slightly irritated is not going to improve performance. Just a couple of words on heat and health. If you stop all the heat leaving the body and you ask somebody to exercise moderately, they'll get to the level of heat illness within about 25 minutes. And Jamie, you saw from the video, was moving along that continuum fairly quickly because you warm up very quickly. Now, of course, as air temperature goes up, as I say, once it gets above skin temperature, then you're gaining heat by conduction, radiation, and convection, and your only route of heat loss is that evaporation of sweat. And if that's impaired because you have to wear protective clothing, whether that be padding, whether that be just a normal running vest, then that's going to make that problem worse. So obviously a lot of time and energy is invested in making sure that these pieces of clothing have good vapor transfer and transferability. As body temperature goes up, you move from heat cramps, muscle cramps, thirst, to heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion you can get with a fairly low deep body temperature because it's primarily related to some of the cardiovascular and electrolyte changes that you see. But as temperature goes up, once you get into the 40s and above about 40.5, you're now in the area of heat stroke, which is a major medical issue and needs to be treated as such. So just to summarize performance and health, heat can hinder performance from 3% to 20%. Heat is the main cause of death in athletes. Heat kills more than any other natural cause. So it's not something to be taken lightly. I mean, just going back to what we heard from Caitlin, of course, a 1 to 2 degree increase in average temperature isn't that much of an issue for sports performance. Where it becomes critical is where you get the increase in the likelihood of a heat wave during the events. And Caitlin can obviously give you, as already said, it's 2 to 3 times more likely that Paris will see a heat wave in the next few weeks, which could well, if it matches the ones we've seen earlier, push the air temperatures into the 40s. That's going to be challenging for all sports, for all officials, and for all spectators. So just to talk about mitigation, now this is in terms of the event. So this is an adaptation, not a mitigation as we would talk about in terms of climate change. So there are levels at which sports will be cancelled. There'll be timetable adjustments, increases in levels of things like hydration stations or reductions in course distance. For intermittent activities, modifying work ratios, adding, like they've done in tennis, rest periods. I have to say that they're all relatively a poor option. And it's more likely that as things get hot, that we're going to end up defaulting to timetable adjustments and cancelling competitions. In any case, you would expect the level of performance, the spectacle, which people are looking at, to be impaired by these temperatures. And then air conditioning rooms, tents for shade, supplies of ice, cold drinks, water-soaked towels, etc. So preventing heat illnesses, there's various approaches and protocols we follow, from a standardized heat exposure where you assess elite athletes at an individual level, because no two people are the same. And at the elite level, you really need to customize the intervention. And that in some cases, that may include not selecting people who are particularly sensitive to performance impairment or health challenges in the heat. And then they go through all the other ones listed on this slide, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want to. But as I say, these need to be done on the basis of a customized assessment of an individual's function in the heat. So the takeaway is heat can impact both performance and health. It impacts physiological function and cognitive performance, and all the other aspects of mood, irritability, concentration. It can have an impact on all sports, not just those associated with high levels of heat production. And it can also affect officials and spectators. And although elite athletes are better able to cope with the heat because they're fitter, got expanded plasma volumes, are heat acclimatized, they're also the individuals who are more likely to ignore all the cues to slow down when they arrive in a competitive situation. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Mike. I mean, that was, I think, an unbelievable blend of comprehensive and brief. So thank you, and very understandable. So thank you for sharing it with us. I feel like I've got about 8 million questions off the back of that. And I actually really do want to ask you about the process of acclimatization, what that looks like. And I'm going to come to that in a second. And then we'll go to the Q&A. But first, just thinking about the report and the recommendations from the report. So there were 5 kind of main recommendations from the report. One was about scheduling. So making sure that events are scheduled at the most kind of appropriate time of day, where, you know, extremes of heat are taken into account and not exposing athletes to unnecessary risk. Second is having those mitigation strategies that you described, Mike, so water breaks and, you know, wet towels and things like that. The third is to actually, picking up on Jamie's point, is to support athletes who are concerned about this, to speak out freely about it and to share their opinions without fear of being criticised for it or being ostracised. The fourth, very relevant for BASIS, is about commitment to collaboration among sports clubs, governing bodies, international federations, about integrating sustainability actions into sport and actually harnessing the power of sport to lead the way on transitions and sustainability. And the fifth is about a reassessment of fossil fuel sponsorship in sport. And Jamie, I know you've spoken about that with real passion in the past, and I do want to open the floor to you on that in a moment. But I'm keen to get an opinion from each of you on which, you know, of those 5 or even beyond those 5, what you want to see change as a result of what we're talking about today. Maybe as a result of the report that we've published, maybe as a result of some of the things that we'll see in Paris. Like, what are the big changes that you want to see, the actions taken? Caitlin, I'm going to start with you on that, if that's okay, and then Jamie, and then Mike.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think I really just want to increase awareness of the fact that these changes have real serious implications. And I know everyone loves sport, but we should really be thinking about safety. And I don't know how we're gonna have to think about how we're gonna be able to do that in the future in a warming world. So I just hope it increases conversation, increases more people talking to each other about it, and just brings more light to the issue.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we're not going to stop talking about this, so we'll keep working with you on it to bang that drum, Caitlin. Jamie, over to you.
Yeah, so for me, it would be threefold. And the first would probably be something that a lot of people on this call are doing well already, which is that strategic approach to reductions in the impact on greenhouse gases and on nature. So sort of baselining, looking at where you want to get to, and then measuring and reporting and increasing positive action there. The second would be using sports global influence. You know, people do look to sport. It has a platform. I'd love to discuss with anyone further. I've just yesterday submitted my dissertation, which was on how sport can influence the uptake of sustainable technologies that we need to get to net zero. And there's a lot in there about sports influence and a good case study there. And then the last, like you mentioned, would be that relationship with fossil fuel companies. Now, I'm careful in my words, but the fossil fuel companies that are maximizing profit by burning fossil fuels for short-term profit, sport needs to assess its relationships with those companies. It's very clear that whatever the vice of our time is, it's generally sponsoring sport. So whether in the past that's been gambling, alcohol, you know, sport is used for sport washing that we're all very aware of, to buy that social license. So I think, given the impact on sport, given the global issue that the climate crisis represents, and given that the science is so clear that we need to transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, these fossil fuel companies that aren't accelerating along that transition path and are using sport to buy time, we need to assess our relationship with those companies.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And I know that I hope that Melissa, I hope you don't mind me saying it, but Melissa Wilson's on this call today, former British rower. And Melissa was instrumental in the production of this report, and I think works closely with you, Jamie, and a number of other athletes to highlight these issues. Spoke incredibly powerfully about that at the BASIS conference at Old Trafford Cricket Ground earlier this year. Mike, over to you for your just reflection on what you want to see change, and then I'm just going to ask a follow-up about acclimatization, and then we're going to open the floor.
Sure. Well, I mean, number one thing to say is all of the above. I agree with everything that's been said, and that level of, you know, informing people and driving for true mitigation. If I go down into a little bit into the weeds of our particular area, actually there were in the recommendations, there were 3 really good bullet points that preceded the smart scheduling, keep athletes safe, etc., which was more developed guidelines to help inform decision making around sporting events. At the moment, those guidelines are not designed for the various sports that they're being applied to. As I say, they were developed by the military for people wearing uniforms, doing marching, as opposed to the kind of intermittent or continuous athletic activities that we're talking about. There's going to be anyway a increase in the amount of monitoring that goes on and wearable technologies, and I think that could be interesting, but I think it's going to throw up some moral and ethical issues to do with, you know, can you imagine stepping in and telling Jamie that he's got to come off because, you know, one of his temperatures has got to a certain level? I mean, that's going to be some of these issues, and stopping people actually, you know, doing what their occupation in many cases is going to be quite tricky. And a greater sharing of resources, which is the 3rd bullet point under the recommendations prior to the headline ones, of information between different federations and different sports. You know, there needs to be some joined up thinking. The actual levels that sports get changed or you know, may well differ between sports, but they've all got to sign up to the same common purpose of smart scheduling, athletic support, keeping athletes safe, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, I really do encourage people to go and read, well, the whole report, but particularly that section, because as Mike says, I think there's a lot in that recommendation section that's worth thinking about and worth taking away. Just Mike, one final question. You know, for athletes who know that they're going into an environment where they can anticipate some extremes, how do they prepare for that? What's the process of preparing for it? And I asked this question partly with, you know, Jamie and, you know, Jamie's colleagues in mind, but also because we've got a number of BASIS members, you know, clubs, governing bodies, federations who are on the call today and who will be able to access this webinar later on. And kind of what steps can they take to make sure that their athletes are prepared, and, you know, steps that they can take to, I guess, to safeguard their well-being to the greatest extent possible?
Well, although, I mean, I know I went through my slides at about 1,000 miles an hour, but I did it in the knowledge that you've recorded the presentation and people can stop and read them at their leisure. But it's, you know, if you're going to perform in the heat, there's a whole range of things that you need to consider. So, you know, you need to have a climate assessment. What actually is the climate likely to be locally to where you're going? And that comes down, I mean, if you're really, and this actually happens, you come down to what side of the road should you be running on if you're doing a marathon? Where is the wind coming from? Is it going to pick heat up on the tarmac and then push it to the other side of the road? So one side of the road is warmer than the other. Where's the shade? So, you know, a proper detailed examination and climatic assessment, including WBGT, probably having a proper hydration and rehydration protocol, not just for the event, but for all of the training you do before. Looking at clothing, getting smart clothing there that will maximize your ability to transfer water vapor and evaporate that water vapor so you actually get some cooling. We know psychological skills training works. We're actually preparing people mentally for going into the heat, and using some of the psychological skills techniques that are used in other areas to make people more confident. Active cooling, you know, so what's the best way of cooling the body whilst you've still got a peripheral circulation? It turns out that it's actually one of the good ways is putting the hands into cold water, and we've introduced that into British cycling now for several Olympics. Whole body fanning is good. So, you know, there's all these aspects. The other thing is to do a standard heat exposure to all the people in a team or all the people in a something, you know, whether it be the British Triathlon, for example, so you understand who struggles the most in the heat, and then you can customize your interventions to give those the most support. By far the best or most powerful physiological intervention is acclimatization to heat. A lot of elite athletes are already a lot of the way there in terms of their physiological adaptations. But generally you need to have up to 10 to 14 days in a representative environment in terms of temperature and relative humidity or water vapor pressure. You need to exercise during those exposures. It doesn't matter particularly what mode of exercise you use. We use a technique called controlled hypothermia, where you get somebody's body temperature up to a certain level, then you use exercise intermittently to keep it there. And that has the effect of having significant impact on things like improved salt balance, greater cardiovascular stability, better thermoregulation, improved work capacity. It's carbohydrate sparing, so your endurance potential improves, and you feel a lot more comfortable. And that then translates into confidence. And you add to that things like pacing strategies in the heat. You may go about doing an event in the heat in a quite a different way as you would in a cool or cold environment. So it's an absolute, a strategic mass of different things that you can do. Importantly, all focused on the individual at that level.
Thanks, Mike. That's really helpful. Jamie, I saw you had your hand up there.
Just maybe interesting as a sort of real life example. I remember one year pre the Dubai Sevens, we did some heat chamber stuff. So we went in groups of 4. So we had our usual training day, but we'd meet at 6 a.m. at the University of Glasgow, and they had a small heat chamber, and we'd go in 4s and jump on a bike for an hour. And they were really tough sessions, but the idea was to sort of pre-acclimatize before we went out. Now, after 2 weeks of doing that, the quality of the sessions that we were getting during that day had dropped so much, and actually the irritability was crazy. There were fights breaking out in training, and I remember as sort of the in the leadership team, we met with the coach and said, we need to stop doing these sessions. We're losing training ability at home. So we end up quite often now getting out there a little bit earlier. But I remember being really hit by the irritability that came across the whole squad, and the quality of session that sort of dropped while we're at home that has always stuck with me.
It's fascinating. Maybe that I realised that maybe I need to spend a bit less time in warm rooms. That might explain a lot. Right,
Dom, just to add to that, we were working with the England rugby team the year prior to the World Cup in South Africa, and everything that Jamie just said, we were told about. Well, they did a tour the year before, and they talked about doing really well in the first test, but by the second test, feeling lethargic, tired. They were falling out with each other. And it was a combination of their heat, but it was also chronic dehydration, which also gives you exactly those. So we introduced it's our fault, unfortunately. When you see people running on the rugby pitch with H2O written on them, that was us trying to introduce a hydration strategy. We told the team to drink as much as they could, which the front row took as drinking as much lager as they could lay their hands on, which didn't help the problem, but there we are. It's definitely a function of heat and dehydration.
Fascinating. Thank you all for the way that you've taken the time to explain all of that. This whole section has taken a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I hope everybody in the call agrees it was worth it to just allow that conversation flowing the way it did. We're going to take the rest of the time on the call just to field any questions that come from the floor. We've only got about 10 minutes left, so I imagine that if there's loads of questions, we're not going to get through all of them. If we don't quite get to it, post your question in the chat and we will follow up in writing with you afterwards. That's a guarantee from me that we'll make sure that happens. But just to say, when you are asking questions, a lot of BASIS members on the call, and a lot of organisations outside the BASIS community, but who are taking action on sustainability, it'd be really good alongside your question to hear about some of those actions and some of the things that you're doing as an organisation to really respond to these challenges. But if you've got a question, then please just use the raise hand function in the at the bottom of your screen, or post your question in the chat and we'll come to it. Are we in a situation where the panel has anticipated every possible question and answered it in advance? Or is everybody reeling from the amount of information that you've received?
Dom, I wanted to ask, but I couldn't actually find the raise hand function, sorry.
Brilliant. Go ahead.
Josh, hi there, guys. Josh from Aquatics GB. Just a question, I guess, for Mike. We've spoken a lot around kind of ambient temperature, and I wondered how much difference that has with regards to stadiums. So we saw in Qatar around, I think, were they air conditioning the stadiums and whatnot, and I'm sure they've probably done that in similar situations. But I just wondered how much of an impact that has for athletes that might be using an arena or might be using an area that potentially the outside temperature is hot, given then the inside arena temperature potentially being even hotter, and the added effects that may have.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I think that's probably also a question for Jamie. So we'll come on to that, because any arenas I've performed in have been empty. So, but the critical thing is the local temperature. It's the microclimate. It's the climate next to the skin. And unfortunately, I mean, actually, it's probably even more physiological. It's actually the afferent information coming from skin thermoreceptors. You want to go down to that level. But in terms of heat exchange, it's the microclimate. So the macroclimate is your stadium. And of course, a stadium that is completely surrounded with spectators is going to have less things like air movement, likely to have a higher humidity. I mean, yes, air conditioners have been used to change that macro environment, which is a little bit self-defeating for all the reasons we know. But it's the temperature next to the skin. So we know that if you are sitting there comfortably, all of us, then I'll guarantee your mean skin temperature is within 0.2 of a degree of 33 degrees Celsius. And it doesn't really matter what the outside temperature is. So the critical thing is to measure the temperature next to the skin, and then the vapor permeability of the environment. So i.e. what's the water vapor pressure in that environment? Because as it gets hotter, that determines how much sweat can evaporate, and sweat that is produced that doesn't evaporate just accelerates dehydration, does nothing for you whatsoever. So that's the important function. I don't know, Jamie's probably been outside and inside a stadium and can tell you practically what happens.
Well, yeah, interestingly, so the Singapore tournament, I mentioned that the stadium is actually air conditioned. So every year we sort of do our training in the build up to the week, and we're outside and we're absolutely dying, but everyone's sort of saying, you know, just get through the week, and by the time you get to the tournament, it's much less bad. And it's got a roof, it's air conditioned, and actually the playing conditions are much better, and it's actually okay once you're there. Now I think you're right. The point is, you know, I'd hate to imagine just how much energy it takes to air condition a stadium. And it's sort of in terms of the context of the climate crisis, it's a bit of a downward spiral. I'd imagine it's not renewably sourced. Even if it is renewably sourced, you know, you're using that energy that is not being used elsewhere. The world's only, I think it's 30 or 40% renewable around the world at the moment. So maybe an answer if we had 100% renewable power in the world that we could air condition the stadiums and get on with sport. But in the current context and the current reality, it doesn't seem like the answer to me anyway.
Just to follow up quickly, of course, the other problem with having everything air conditioned is a very good way of dehydrating you, because it produces a dry, cool air that you breathe in, and the lung will 100% humidify every breath in. So the drier the air you breathe in, the more fluid you're losing through the respiratory passages, as opposed to through sweating when you breathe out, which is people who then go and live in an air conditioned plane, to an air conditioned hotel, to an air conditioned stadium, are much more likely to be dehydrated, or it adds to the dehydration load.
Thank you both for that. And Josh, thanks for the question. And I'm just going to take a moment to plug the sustainability strategy that Aquatics GB published just around the time of your national championships, which also served as the Olympic qualifiers. Do go and check it out. Anybody on the call who hasn't seen it, because it's a really good and interesting piece of work. Just a couple of quick questions coming in the chat before we finish. One from James Carrick around how much influence do the kind of main either commercial or broadcasting partners have on the planning and timings of major sporting events. I think from the broadcasting point of view, the influence is enormous. I'm not Jamie, just thinking about from your perspective as an athlete, I should say at this point, that BASIS is working with a number of broadcasters on promoting sustainability in sport. So perhaps this is something we'll take away and just raise with them and come back to you, James. But from your point of view of as an athlete, thinking about the big pinnacle moments in your career and the fact that they are broadcast, then I imagine, want to see a maximum audience for it, which is, again, I imagine what broadcasters are after. But if that scheduling then puts you in a risky situation, like it's quite a tough position to be in as an athlete, I suppose, isn't it? Because you want the exposure, but at the same time you don't want the risk.
Yeah, and I imagine TV are pretty rigid on when they can broadcast these events. And it actually got me thinking about a point I didn't make, which is the business case around sport. And if we're seeing these increased heat events that mean that athletes can't compete, and maybe TV are really rigid there and they can't just broadcast at a different time, and especially with flooding and extreme events on the increase, I think we are going to see more cancellation of sport. And that becomes an issue. For an example, like Scottish Rugby, where I've been an athlete, they make most of their money from the 5 Six Nations games every year. And if one of them is cancelled for whatever reason, I'm pretty sure you're right, TV is going to broadcast it that weekend. And if it can't happen that weekend, it's probably not going to happen. It can't be rescheduled to another time. Yeah. So then the business case of sport, either you're making a straight loss or your insurance premiums are going through the roof. So with increasing temperatures, it becomes an absolutely massive threat to not only the athlete's health, but actually the business of sport and the way it works.
Thanks, Jamie. James, we'll try and take that up actually with some of the broadcasters that we work alongside and just get an answer to that question and see where that conversation goes. I think we are running out of time. A question from Graham Hunter that I just want to address in the chat. I feel like we know the answer to this one and it's grim, but what do we anticipate to be the trigger points for action on the increase in heat risks in sport? Just calls to mind Daniil Medvedev, the world #2 tennis player at the time of the Tokyo Olympics, when he came off court and saying, what is it going to take a player to die for them to do something about it? And we've heard actually from Mike and Jamie about there is a massive amount of mortality risk and instances of it. And I think actually for Jamie and Mike, just a reaction to that really, and is that the level it's going to have to get to before action is taken? Is there a way we can avoid that?
Just very quickly, I mean, I work across the board in extreme environments, and it's nearly always, unfortunately, a disaster that provokes a reaction. Whether that be Estonia, Herald of Free Enterprise, Piper Alpha, unfortunately. Having said that, the WBGT index I talked about, there are different sports do now have different levels for black flagging events, and it's 28 degrees, around 25 to 30 degrees Celsius for WBGT. So they have those things where they will say, right, this event needs to be cancelled. And then you slip into what James was saying about the problems with sponsorship, etc., etc. So I hope it doesn't come to a catastrophe for things to happen, but it wouldn't surprise me if it did.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks, Mike. Let's hope it doesn't, and let's hope that this work and the work that lots of other organisations are doing can contribute to avoiding that eventuality. And let's keep our fingers crossed that Paris is only a magnificent sporting spectacle and nothing else. We are out of time. I'm sorry to everybody who's asked the question in the chat who we haven't been able to get to. I promise you we will follow up. We'll follow up with everybody who's joined this call. With links and further reading, with the video. I understand that the audio wasn't playing on the video. I'm sorry about that. I thought it was worth a try. It didn't work in testing, but I thought it was worth a try. We'll follow up with it so you can see it in full, because it really is worth watching. Really grateful to you all for taking the time to be here. Particular thanks to our panel. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. I've felt really privileged to be part of it. So thank you to all three of you.